As a tank, it isn't unexpected for your experience and content to vary greatly depending on what healer or healers that you get paired up with. Sometimes you might even be outright expected to know how a specific healer functions, what domes are good for you, and why exactly that white mage for the third time in just this one dungeon appears to intentionally let you almost die. In this video, I will go over, from a tank's perspective, how each healer functions in terms of features you might care about, such as their ability to keep you alive while simultaneously doing damage. As I go over each healer, I will also highlight the differences at different level ranges if necessary. Obviously, if you are in a leveling dungeon at level 30, the fact that most healers can keep you up without casting healing spells at higher level isn't particularly relevant, is it? This guide will also mainly focus on dungeon content, as in raid content, the presence of two different types of healers, usually, can often paint over the major differences between them. On that note, let's first start with some general stuff. Good healers are more likely to view your HP as a resource. As long as you don't die, ultimately only the last point of HP actually matters. This means that you're almost certainly not in danger just because you're missing HP. In fact, as you may know, tanks are capable of healing themselves in varying capacities, so the healer letting you lose some HP before they jump the gun might actually be quite nice. That of course leads to the follow-up question as to what a healer could possibly have to do that is more important than healing spells. Why? Attacking, of course. The exact amount is difficult to place, but on a single target, your average healer can certainly do around half the damage of an actual DPS. And for comparison, it isn't entirely off to say that a tank can do around 2/3, so the damage of a healer should not be neglected. Healers attacking extra aggressively is more common the higher level you get, simply because at higher levels, healers have more options that don't rely on spells. With that said, a healer who is attacking is usually a good sign that things are okay. The exception being that some healers are a bit overly aggressive and take risks that should not be taken. On the other hand, a healer who is casting a healing spell is also not always a bad sign. Finally, healers exist in two different categories: Pure Healer and Barrier Healer, named by the game itself. You can find these in the Party Finder menu. The key difference between them is that a Pure Healer is mainly focused on burst healing, and their healing spells are typically more than enough to keep you alive if everything else fails. Barrier healers, on the other hand, are more focused on passive healing and healing over time, weirdly, and their spells mainly serve to add shields to intercept damage or reduce it, which would help buy time for the healing over time to take effect, or to survive an especially large hit. This difference means that a pure healer will be a lot more okay with you dropping super low in HP, because they're usually capable of healing you back up from any amount. A barrier healer, on the other hand, prefers to keep you at a safe and healthy amount all the time, so that they can safely plan their heal over time effects accordingly. As barrier healers don't have the same capacity to easily heal you back up with spells, running them out of cooldowns can also be a future death sentence if you don't have the tools to keep yourself alive after that. And with that, we start with the pure healer, White Mage. This job is unique in that it has a lot more healing GCD options, but are a lot more limited in healing OGCD options. This means that if at all possible, a White Mage is likely to prepare you with regen either just before the pull begins or sometimes during the pull to maintain your HP before the fighting begins proper. Tools like Aquaveil and Divine Benison are also commonly used at the start of the fighting to minimize the damage you actually take. White Mage's main resource is the Lily found in their healing gauge. They get one of these every 20 seconds of combat, and spending them gives them access to an attack that deals a huge amount of damage. As such, White Mages are likely to feel motivated to spend these aggressively. However, more advanced White Mages tend to toss these in between fighting, as the offensive resource, the Blood Lily, is still fed even if the lilies are spent outside of combat. This is because the lilies are spent with GCDs. Assuming the lilies are not spent outside of fighting, it isn't uncommon to see a White Mage spend these regardless of whether you actually need healing, as it can be viewed as a gain for them, even if the lily is entirely wasted. Similar to this, they have the OGCD Asais that both heals, does damage, and recovers MP, so they tend to use this even if no healing is needed at all. This truly culminates when we look at White Mage's AoE attack, Holy, which has a cast time equal to the GCD, meaning there is no space to cast an OGCD heal anyway, which also combines with White Mage having Presence of Mind as a burst cooldown. Because of this, it is quite common for a White Mage to spam Holy until you're actually in mortal danger, and only then do something about it. This means that it is not necessarily a problem if you drop extremely low in HP during the first many seconds of a fight, as the White Mage might be actively planning for that. Holy also comes with the benefit of stunning the enemies, which leads to a combined 4 + 2 + 1 second stun that can greatly reduce the damage you actually end up taking. To the point that, assuming the White Mage is going for it immediately, you might not want to use any of your cooldowns until the stuns are over. It is worth noting that if the stun disappears for even a fraction of a second, all of the mobs might be able to swing at you just then. Not much you can do about that, but it is worth keeping in mind if you're somewhat low on HP already. White Mages can make up for this weird tendency to play chicken with your HP by having some of the strongest instant healing options in the game, in the form of Benediction in particular, which fully heals you. And the combination of a single Afflatus Solace with Tetragrammaton may deliver a weaker but still exceptional healing amount. White Mages can also make use of Temperance to further reduce the damage you take, while also increasing the healing they themselves provide through their spells. A particular effect you should be aware of when grouping with White Mages is that they can place down the Dome of Healing, Asylum. Simply stand in it. It is very large, it shouldn't be a major problem unless the White Mage placed it weirdly. All of these details mean, ultimately, that a White Mage greatly appreciates if you can take care of the healing and survivability mostly on your own for as much of the fight as possible, as that maximizes their ability to attack and delays the need for them to act on healing you. At lower levels, White Mage tends to have nothing in terms of OGCD healing, so they are completely reliant on their healing spells to keep you alive, meaning they can't deal well with sudden surprises. More aggressive White Mages are still very likely to let you drop very low if they predict the enemies will die first in these situations. Next, the Pure Healer Astrologian, which sets itself apart from White Mage clearly by having a lot of OGCD healing options. Despite this, an Astrologian is still likely to prepare you with their equivalent aspected benefic healing over time before pull begins or during the pull itself to maintain your HP before the fighting begins proper. Tools like Celestial Intersection and Exaltation are also commonly used at the start of the fighting to minimize the damage you actually take. Uniquely for Astrologians, many of their healing options are delayed, meaning that they activate them in advance. Some are automatically triggered after a set amount of time, like with Exaltation. Others are instead placed in advance and either mature over time, build over time, or can be matured by a certain action, but can always be triggered manually if desired. Horoscope is placed and matures through Aspected Helios, which is a setup that isn't unusual to see before a pull or during a pull. Macrocosmos itself is actually a spell and an attack, but heals based on the amount of damage taken before it is triggered. Earthly Star is similar to a dome like White Mage's Asylum, and you should simply stay within the yellow dotted line. Additionally, Earthly Star also does damage, so it is beneficial to also make sure enemies are within it. For you, what ultimately matters most is at least recognizing these different action icons as buffs on your character, so you know the healing is coming eventually. Astrologian's AoE attack, Gravity, is centered on their target instead of centered on themselves, meaning they can stand at a safe distance unlike other healers. Gravity also has a cast time short enough that they can weave an OGCD after each cast. However, it is worth keeping in mind that Astrologians tend to start fights with a lot of offensive OGCDs planned in playing cards for buffs for the team and Divination, their raid buff. As such, despite them having plenty of options to heal you, they tend to appreciate having the first several seconds of a fight, at least every now and then, be without needing to heal you. So, like with White Mage, it is greatly beneficial if you can maintain yourself for the first several seconds. This is, however, a bit different with Astrologians, as they can prepare all those heals before they start their card playing. It is still not surprising if an Astrologian intentionally lets you drop low before they do anything about it. This is because some of their best healing options include Essential Dignity, which heals for more the less HP you had in the first place, so they are incentivized to let you drop to at least 30% before they do much about it. It is also worth noting that Astrologian has a few ways to empower their healing spells in a tight spot. They just have far less reason to actually do that than a White Mage does. At lower levels, Astrologians still have access to Essential Dignity and of course have less OGCD healing options. However, they are also much less incentivized to play cards in massive bursts in lower levels, opening up the opportunity to simply heal when needed. The Barrier Healer Scholar is next. As a barrier healer, they have access to a pet that passively heals anyone who needs it all the time. Somewhat similar to White Mage, Scholars have their own reasons to prefer to not heal you if they can. It is pretty common for a Scholar to apply an Adloquium's shield to you before fighting begins, and it is not uncommon for this to also be accompanied by Protraction to increase it. Scholar's main resource, Etherflow, grants them access to their best healing options in general, and they get 3 charges every minute, even if they can stockpile 3 and let the cooldown finish. As the action itself grants them MP, it is quite crucial to get it used on cooldown. Despite Etherflow granting Scholars access to their best healing options, it also is spent on Energy Drain, which does a small amount of damage, so any Etherflow that wasn't needed equates to free damage. As such, it isn't uncommon for some Scholars to try and make do with their pet's healing options, which are nothing to sneeze at either of course, to be able to spend Etherflow on damage instead. This also means that if you can minimize the healing you require, the Scholar might be able to squeeze out more damage than usual, which is further emphasized because they can even send away their pet for a bit for extra Etherflow. Speaking of pet actions, most of them are just heals that you don't have to really worry about, but Ether Pact is a green beam channeled to you, and you don't have to be scared of it. It just heals you. In terms of the Scholar's own Etherflow options, it is very common for Scholars who apply the somewhat unique Excogitation to you whenever possible. It heals for a large amount when you drop below 50% HP, which means that Scholars can often feel safe not overspending on you as long as this buff persists. It is also common for Scholars to place their Dome, Sacred Soil, which reduces damage taken and heals you, so try to stay within it when it is active. It is quite big. Scholar's AoE attack, Art of War, has no cast time, meaning they are free to move around and cast any OGCDs they desire during AoE combat. They also provide the Chain Stratagem debuff to one enemy sometimes, which increases the damage you do on that particular target by increasing crit chance. As Scholars are barrier healers, their options for fully healing you from very low are very limited, so they tend to maintain your HP at a safe amount all the time. This means you can generally expect them to act in a much more predictable way, a bit of healing all the time, compared to pure healers that might postpone the whole healing thing until it is required. This does, however, mean that Scholars handle things going wrong worse than pure healers, and while it is always a good idea to communicate when you intend to drop low to use an invulnerability or what have you, it is especially important with barrier healers, and Scholar is no exception to that. If they blow all of their resources trying to save you when it wasn't needed, it can mean that the Scholar has nothing left for you once your invulnerability finally ends. At lower levels, Scholar's pet is a much more overwhelming force in terms of raw healing, so sometimes the Scholar is more like an additional DPS. Already by level 45, Scholar has access to Etherflow and their spammable spender loss rate, so they can compensate easily for any healing in this level range that their pet cannot live up to alone. Typically, despite being considered a rather hard job to maneuver, Scholar is probably by far the strongest healer in the lower level range. And finally, the barrier healer Sage. As a barrier healer, they have access to Cardia, which heals a target of their choice, usually you, the tank, every time they attack. Similar to Scholars, it is pretty common for a Sage to apply a new Creation Diagnosis shield to you before fighting begins, although it is a bit more rare to see it accompanied by Krasis and Zoe, which sometimes end up being kept as emergency options. Sage's main resource, Adderskull, is generated 1 every 20 seconds and can be accumulated up to 3 at any one time. Unlike Scholar, Sage has no way of spending this offensively. In fact, Adderskull rewards the Sage with MP recovery when they're spent. As a result, Sages have a tendency to be very upfront with their Adderskull options compared to their regular cooldowns. The combination of Keracholi and Tavracholi, sometimes assisted by Cholos as well, allows a Sage to maintain an almost permanent 10% damage reduction on the tank, which might as well be entirely permanent during AoE pulls. This is then supplemented with other healing over time effects and repeating barriers like Heimer and Panheimer to reduce the damage you take as much as possible. Because Sage has no offensive gain from sitting on their cooldowns, it is a lot more common for a Sage to have a completely planned out strategy for an entire dungeon run, meaning that once you understand what their plan is, their approach is entirely predictable, and you should be able to adjust your cooldowns around it if you so desire. Do note, of course, that not all Sages play in such a regimented way. Sage's AoE attack, Dyscrasia, has no cast time, meaning they are free to move around and cast any OGCDs they desire during AoE combat. This is further supplemented with Phlegma, which does more damage, but is on a cooldown. They can even use Toxicon to keep up the attack while stepping away. However, Toxicon rely on their offensive resource at a Sting, which are simply produced by letting their Eucratian Diagnosis shield on you break. As the majority of the Sage toolkit is a mishmash of minor damage reduction, small barriers and heal over time effects mainly, they, similar to Scholar, don't have many good and reliable options to pick you up from very low HP. Their strongest option being Norma, empowered by Zoe. For that reason, similar to Scholar, it is a very good idea to warn a Sage before you intentionally drop to low HP amounts, so they don't blow everything trying to save you when it wasn't needed in the first place. At lower levels, when synced down, similar to Scholar, Sages can often keep you alive with just their signature Cardia, and by level 45, they can use Adderskull to cast Ryuholi at least once every 20 seconds. As they may rely more on casted spell healing in these lower levels, which would cause Cardia to do nothing, Scholar is typically considered a bit stronger in that regard, and often places Sage closer to Astrologian in healer power in this level range, depending on what you need, as Eucratian Diagnosis being instant is quite effective in the enormously long hallways of A Realm Reborn dungeons. So the full summary is that the pure healers tend to have a very specific offensive plan at the start of a fight and tend to deal with healing reactively as needed due to the majority of their tools being straight up healing. Barrier healers instead tend to have much less need to plan their offense and simply plan their defense from the very start to make sure you never get in enough danger that they will be forced to play reactively. Knowing this, hopefully you can adjust your play around how they play so you both do your best. And of course, to round up, for a guide aimed at tanks, you might be thinking I'm being very vague about what exactly you should do about things. The key here is that exactly what you need to do can vary heavily, and in some capacity, what healer you have might not actually matter that much, even if you are interested in knowing how to play around them. The most important part is that tanks who sometimes might intentionally drop low may want to be a little bit more upfront about that with a barrier healer than a pure healer. And, on the other hand, a pure healer might appreciate being a bit more front-loaded with your cooldowns as opposed to a barrier healer who will be healing you constantly and so would prefer a more even spread of cooldowns if there is a choice. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Sage's Keracholi heals for 500 potency over 15 seconds, and is supposed to be basically a copy of Scholar's Sacred Soil. However, Sacred Soil being a placed dome, actually heals for 100 potency immediately, and then 500 potency over 15 seconds, making it slightly superior. Isn't that something?